Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the shocking medieval diet. What royalty actually ate behind those towering castle walls. Imagine waking up in a grand, cold stone chamber, the sunlight barely filtering through the narrow windows. Your bed is grand, maybe a velvet coverlet with a canopy, but the comfort ends there. The first thing you smell is the dampness in the air, perhaps mingling with the scent of wood smoke from the hearth. Now, what would breakfast look like for royalty? Certainly not a quick cup of coffee and a croissant. Instead, imagine a thick, hearty meal to start the day. You'd probably expect eggs, maybe a pastry or fruit. But for the royals of medieval Europe, breakfast was far more complex, surprisingly weird. They often began their day with foods like spiced porridge or dense heavy breads far from the light, delicate breakfasts we're used to today. But here's the real kicker. Meat was considered a luxury, and it was mostly avoided in the morning meal. Yes, kings and queens woke up to rich dishes that still set the tone for the rest of their day, but not with the meat-heavy feasts you might expect that so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, back to those medieval mornings. You might think they'd start with a spread of meats, maybe some sausages or bacon. Instead, the first meal of the day often consisted of bread, usually unleavened or rye, a staple in many parts of medieval Europe. Along with that, a hot porridge made from oats or barley, sometimes flavored with honey or berries, provided much needed sustenance. This hearty fare was washed down with a cup of ale or watered down wine. Yes, water was often avoided for fear of contamination. Imagine starting your morning with a strong ale, and you begin to see why medieval royalty wasn't just known for their lavish banquets, but their constant buzz. Historians still argue whether such indulgences were necessary for energy, or if the medieval upper classes simply wanted to emphasize their power and prestige through extravagant feasts. But one thing is for sure. The royalties' meals were designed to impress, not just to nourish. What better way to announce your status than to start the day with a meal as grand as your castle? The heavy, grain-based breakfasts gave them the stamina to survive long hours of feasts and banquets. But they weren't always about surviving. Sometimes it was all about showing off. And show off they did, while most peasants struggled with simple fare. Kings and queens would feast on a variety of fine breads, honey, fruits, and sometimes small pastries or even cheese. Now, as we move into the next part of this medieval diet tale, things get even more bizarre. You see, royalty wasn't just indulging in food, they were indulging in power. Let's step into the grand dining halls of the medieval elite, where food was much more than just a meal. It was a spectacle, a show of dominance. It wasn't uncommon to see gigantic feasts laid out in the grandest halls, sometimes spanning hours with multiple courses. And the foods, oh, they were just as wild as the drama that played out. Picture the feast. Platters of roasted boar, flaming, game birds, and sweet dishes piled high, all surrounded by jug after jug of ale and wine. The pomp, the pageantry, the theatrics of it, all it was the original reality show, only no one was going to be kicked off the island. But the real kicker, the royals didn't just gorge on these massive meals, they actually wasted a lot of the food. Plates of fruit, meats, and extravagant pastries would be served, but not always finished. Sometimes, After a course, the food would just be discarded, especially when a new dish took its place. This excess was a deliberate statement royalty wanted to show that they could afford to waste food. To them, it was a mark of wealth. And we're not talking about a couple of crumbs, here more like entire hams and oversized pies. But was this wasteful excess really a sign of power? Or were the royals merely trapped in a cycle of indulgence? And you thought your lunch leftovers were bad? Imagine having so much food you couldn't even finish it before the next course came out. And yet, despite the overabundance, the royal diet wasn't always a balanced one. Historians have pointed out that while the nobility enjoyed a wide variety of meats, wines, and delicacies, they often lacked vegetables and other healthful foods that might have balanced out their diets. Now, for a moment, imagine what life was like in the kitchens of these royal homes. The preparation for such massive feasts was no small feat. Large kitchens with multiple cooks, assistants, and servants worked tirelessly for hours to create the meals, ensuring everything was perfectly timed and ready for the ceremonial moment. But there's a catch. While the chefs worked with fancy spices and expensive ingredients, these meals weren't always as sophisticated as you might think. The royal palates were often overwhelmed with rich, fatty meats and sugars, leaving little room for fresh, lighter fare. And let's not even get into what they considered exotic foods, some of which might make you squirm. Ever heard of an eel pie? Royalty, especially in England, considered eel a delicacy often served in pies or stews, sometimes flavored with exotic spices. You could almost say the royal dinner table was like an episode of Fear Factor, but with more pomp and less fear. Unless, of course, you were the one eating it. And peacock. Yes, roasted peacock was on the menu. Not for the faint-hearted. And definitely not for the modern-day vegetarian. Historians still debate whether these extravagant feasts were simply about indulgence or if they also served a political purpose. After all, when you're feeding an entire court of noblemen and vassals, you're not just feeding them physically, you're feeding their loyalty, their perception of you as a powerful ruler. So, the next time you sit down to your dinner, maybe reflect on the peculiarities of royal meals and how much effort went into keeping that power on the plate. The royals knew exactly how to make their meals as extravagant as their lives heavy, indulgent, and more about showing off than sustaining the body. But despite all this indulgence, one thing is clear. The medieval royal diet was as complex as the politics of the time. As we head into the next section, remember, the royals were just getting started with their food extravagance. It was about more than eating it. It was about creating a legacy. As we continue our journey through the fascinating medieval diet, let's now step into the grand feasts fit for royalty. Picture yourself entering a vast stone-arched hall, the long wooden table stretching ahead like a battleground of indulgence. The atmosphere is rich with the scent of roasted meats, simmering sauces, and the faint whiff of spices that dominate the air. But don't get too comfortable, because what you're about to see will make modern buffet spreads look like a mere snack. For medieval royalty, a meal wasn't just about food. It was an experience, a spectacle designed to showcase power and wealth. So, let's talk about these extravagant banquets. The royal table would often be laden with not just one, but multiple courses, each more decadent than the last. First came the meats, roasted boars, venison, and wild game birds like pheasants and swans, prepared with a level of detail you probably can't imagine today. And we're not talking about just a few slices here and there. Entire animals were roasted and served, with the meats cut into elaborate arrangements that made every guest feel like they were part of something far beyond the ordinary. But what else was on the menu? Well, once the meats were devoured, it was time for the fruits, nuts, and pies, luxurious pastries filled with everything from dried fruits to exotic spices. The table didn't stop there, though. You could also expect exotic dishes, foods that had traveled from far-off lands, carried by merchants or ambassadors. In these feasts, the concept of exotic wasn't just a term. It was a literal journey across continents, spices from the east, sugar from the south, and even fruits from distant colonies. These foods weren't just eaten for their taste, but for the prestige they represented. The very act of eating them was a way to flaunt one's wealth, as if to say, I've tasted the world, and the world tastes just like my power. The amount of food served at these banquets was nothing short of staggering. It wasn't unusual for a royal feast to last for hours, with dishes coming and going in a seemingly endless parade. The guests, often nobility from across the realm, were treated to a sensory overload of sight, smell, and taste that most people today can only dream of experiencing. But it wasn't just about the food. Banquets were also places for political maneuvering and alliances. As the food flowed, so did the discussions about lands, wars, and marriages, all wrapped up in the cloak of gluttony and opulence. And while the royals were stuffing their faces with the finest meats and richest wines, you could hear the clatter of knives and forks in the background as the servants worked tirelessly to maintain the pace of the feast. Now, if you're starting to wonder whether such indulgence ever had any consequences, don't worry, because this lavish feasting had more than just a political purpose, had a physical one too. Historians still argue whether such opulent eating habits were designed solely to display wealth, or if they also served a more practical function, providing the nutrition and energy needed for the busy lifestyle of medieval royalty. After all, these kings and queens didn't just lounge around all day. They were involved in warfare, court politics, and diplomacy. So, the need for energy must have been real. But here's the thing, while the royalty were indeed indulging in rich, heavy meals, they were also consuming a lot of sugar, fat, and meat. And as you can imagine, all that indulgence wasn't the healthiest choice. But back in those days, health wasn't exactly the top priority. Instead, it was about creating a legacy, a spectacle, a reputation that would echo through the halls of history. The problem with such lavish dining was that it didn't come without consequences. Royalty had their own issues with health, despite being surrounded by the best foods. Many suffered from conditions like gout, caused by excessive consumption of rich meats and sugary drinks. Gout, a painful condition affecting the joints, became something of a royal disease, often linked to overindulgence in both food and drink. It wasn't uncommon for kings and queens to suffer from these ailments, which, ironically, would have been a sign of their excess. Imagine walking around with swollen feet and painful joints. Definitely not the most glamorous side of medieval life, despite all the grandeur. But the royals didn't let their health issues get in the way of their indulgence. In fact, many believed that a proper diet, full of rich and extravagant foods, would keep them healthy and strong, so they continued to feast, ignoring the growing consequences. And it wasn't just the food choices that played a role in their health. The consumption of alcohol, especially wine and ale, was another factor. For the medieval royalty, it was an unspoken rule that the goblets never stopped flowing, water rarely. Wine and ale were seen as far safer options. In fact, in medieval times, people believed that drinking wine, especially when diluted with water, was far healthier than drinking water from unknown sources, which were often contaminated. But even with all that alcohol and food, there was one aspect of medieval royal feasts that may surprise you: the lack of proper hygiene. Royalty, despite their grandeur, didn't exactly have access to modern-day cleanliness standards. They didn't have the luxury of antibacterial soap or sanitation systems we enjoy today. So while they feasted on exotic foods and drank lavish wines, they were likely surrounded by bacteria and germs in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. It's a strange contrast: royalty living in their castles of wealth, yet completely unaware of the invisible threats around them. Imagine sitting at the table with your plate full of roasted boar, surrounded by fruits and spices, yet knowing that you might have a stomach bug from poor hygiene. A bit unsettling, isn't it? Now, as we continue to explore the shocking medieval diet, we've only scratched the surface. The feasts were just one part of a much larger picture, one filled with lavish excess, but also with a tinge of tragedy. From the bizarre ingredients to the strange health consequences, the royal diet of medieval Europe was more than just food. It was a reflection of power, status, and the quirks of a time long gone. Now that you've witnessed the grand feasts and extravagant banquets of medieval royalty, you might think that meat was the central star of these royal meals. But here's the plot twist: meat wasn't always a prominent feature of the diet. For royalty, at least, not in the way you'd expect. In fact, many royal figures, particularly those with strong religious ties, actually avoided meat for long stretches of time. So, you might wonder, how could these kings and queens indulge in luxury and still stay away from the most obvious symbol of wealth and power, meat? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The religious influence on medieval life, especially for the royals, was immense. The church played a powerful role in the day-to-day lives of medieval monarchs, dictating everything from how they dressed to what they ate. This influence often dictated periods of fasting, during which meat was strictly forbidden. Yes, you heard that right. No juicy steaks, no roasted boar, no sumptuous venison. Instead, the royals would turn to other foods to sustain them during these fasting periods. One popular alternative was fish, which was seen as a fitting substitute during fasting times. But not just any fish from the royal rivers, lakes, or even the seas surrounding their castles. Some of the royal feasts even included extravagant dishes made from fish. But in the context of fasting, this wasn't just a choice, it was an expectation. And while this might seem like a healthy alternative, it also had its own set of challenges. For one, medieval fish was often preserved in ways that might make modern palates shudder. Salted fish, smoked fish, and pickled fish were common at royal tables, and you can imagine how they might taste after months of preservation. But the avoidance of meat during fasting periods didn't mean the royals were going hungry. No, in fact, they had plenty of alternatives to keep their bellies full. A favorite among royalty during these times was the so-called vegetable feast. In place of meat, they indulged in various vegetable-based dishes, often made with ingredients that we might now consider quite exotic things, like artichokes, leeks, turnips, and peas. These vegetables were often cooked in rich broths or combined with honey, spices, and even wine. It wasn't exactly a modern vegetarian's dream meal, but it was the closest thing the royals had to a meatless feast. You might be surprised to learn that even some of the most famous kings, like King Henry VIII, who is usually associated with excessive indulgence and gluttony, adhered to fasting rules at certain points. During his reign, meat was forbidden. On certain religious holidays, and even he, with his enormous appetites, would be expected to adhere to these periods of fasting. So while Henry VIII is best known for his lavish banquets and indulgence in meats like roast swan and venison, he too would have been partaking in these religiously mandated fasting periods where meat was out of the question. Imagine the irony of such a meat-loving king sitting down to a vegetable feast of leeks and onions, all while knowing that his court would be anxiously awaiting the next feast filled with hearty meats. But this was the reality of medieval life. The religious edicts around fasting and abstinence from meat shaped not only the royal diet, but the entire court culture. You might think that avoiding meat during fasting periods would make for a dull and unfulfilling meal, but that wasn't the case. Historians argue that the medieval nobility was remarkably creative when it came to fasting meals, crafting elaborate, flavorful dishes that still conveyed wealth and prestige, even without the signature meats of the time. The royals turned to other forms of protein, like eggs and dairy, to get their fill of sustenance. In fact, eggs were a prominent part of medieval royal meals, often used in pies and tarts, or simply served in dishes like omelettes or custards. Cheese was another royal favorite, with rich varieties of goat, cow, and sheep cheese being staples on the dining table. Still, you may wonder, did the avoidance of meat during fasting periods have any lasting effect on the health of medieval royalty? Well, historians still argue whether these religious dietary rules had any significant impact on the health of kings and queens. On one hand, eating more vegetables and fish might have provided some health benefits, such as more vitamins and fewer fat-induced ailments, but on the other hand, the lack of meat might have led to certain deficiencies. You see, medieval royalty was used to consuming rich, fatty meats, which provided energy and certain nutrients. By switching to vegetable-heavy dishes, they might have missed out on some of the vitamins and minerals typically found in animal products, like vitamin B12. But again, royal diets weren't just about health. They were about power, showmanship, and yes, sometimes sheer indulgence. And so, while fasting from meat might have caused some dietary imbalance, it was also a demonstration of piety and adherence to religious norms. You could argue that the very act of following such fasting rules, especially for the powerful elite, was a kind of flex in itself, an assertion of control over both body and spirit. So, after all this talk of meatless days, let's not forget that when the royals weren't fasting, they were enjoying some of the richest, most decadent meals available in the medieval world. It was a true juxtaposition, indulgence and restraint coexisting in the same meal plan. From giant feasts of roasted boar to sparse vegetable fare during fasting, the medieval diet was a constant dance between excess and austerity. As we continue exploring the strange and fascinating diet of medieval royalty, remember this: food wasn't just sustenance, it was a symbol. It was a political tool, a way to flaunt wealth, power, and piety all in one meal. And in the end, it was all about creating an image of grandeur that would be remembered for centuries. Now that we've explored how meat was often kept off the royal table during fasting periods, let's delve into one of the most intriguing aspects of medieval royalty's diet: their fascination with herbs and spices. Imagine sitting at the royal table, where every dish is infused with exotic flavors that seem to transport you to distant lands. But what exactly was so special about medieval spices? To understand this, let's first take a moment to appreciate the sheer rarity of spices in medieval Europe. While today we can find a wide range of herbs and spices in every supermarket, back then these were not just ingredients, they were treasures. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, ginger, and pepper weren't just added for flavor. They were a symbol of status and wealth, and the royals knew it. The medieval aristocracy, particularly the kings and queens, would often show off their status through the extravagant use of spices in their meals. These spices, many of which were imported from distant regions like the Middle East and India, were considered luxury items that only the wealthy could afford. Historians still argue about the precise role spices played in medieval life. Were they used primarily for their flavor, or was there also a belief in their medicinal properties? Some scholars believe that the consumption of spices was tied to the idea of health and wellness, with certain spices being thought to have healing powers. For instance, cinnamon was often used in medieval recipes, not just to enhance flavor, but also because it was believed to warm the body, while ginger was seen as a remedy for indigestion. But there was also a darker side to the use of spices. The royals were often obsessed with maintaining their health and beauty, and they turned to exotic concoctions to help with everything from digestion to skincare. This brings us to the next fascinating aspect of the medieval diet: its obsession with food as medicine. You might not expect it, but medieval royals didn't just eat to enjoy, they often ate to cure. And no, they didn't have modern medicine or treatments. Instead, they relied heavily on the idea that food itself could prevent illness and keep them in peak health. This meant that their diet was often filled with medicinal foods, foods that were believed to have therapeutic properties. Take, for example, the consumption of certain meats and broths. Medieval royalty would often eat rich, hearty broths made from meats like beef, veal, and mutton, believing that these broths had the power to heal the body. These broths were thought to help with everything from digestion to strength. At times, medicinal herbs were even added to these broths to increase their curative properties. In fact, some medieval recipes specifically combined various meats, herbs, and spices in the belief that the mixture would act as a sort of preventative medicine. It's a far cry from the modern-day concept of superfoods, but in their time, these broths and stews were thought to be just as essential for maintaining good health as any modern supplement. But as we look deeper into the medieval royal diet, we see another layer of complexity. While the aristocracy indulged in lavish meals and cured themselves with so-called medicinal foods, there were also darker, more unpleasant aspects of their dietary choices. The royals often ate foods that we would find questionable today, especially when it came to the preservation of food. Without refrigeration or modern methods of food storage, the preservation of meats, fruits, and other perishables was a serious challenge. And so, the royal kitchens became a place where strange and sometimes unsettling methods of preservation were employed. One of the most commonly used preservation methods was salting. Large cuts of meat were often salted to keep them from spoiling, but the process could leave the meat with a distinctly pungent flavor. Similarly, meats and fish were often smoked, sometimes for weeks at a time. The smoking process, while effective in preserving food, could result in food that was more than a little tough and dry. Imagine sitting down to a banquet where the meats were prepared using these preservation techniques. What should have been a tender cut of roast might have been instead a salted, dried hunk of meat with a smoky aftertaste. Another common preservation method was pickling. Vegetables, fruits, and even some meats were often pickled in vinegar or brine to ensure they lasted through the long winter months. But pickled food wasn't just a preservation method, it was also a way to enhance the flavors of dishes. Pickled onions, for example, were a common accompaniment to meats, offering a tangy contrast to the richness of roasted or stewed meats. But here's the kicker: some of these preserved foods didn't always work out as planned. The lack of proper preservation techniques sometimes led to spoiled food, especially in the royal kitchens, where large quantities of food were prepared in advance. Historians still argue whether some medieval royals were actually poisoned by spoiled food, as the constant use of preservatives could sometimes have unintended consequences. It wasn't uncommon for guests at a royal banquet to experience food poisoning, or worse, from dishes that had been improperly prepared or stored. Despite the risks, the royals continued to indulge in preserved foods, often unwilling to sacrifice the luxury and grandeur associated with their meals. In fact, many royal chefs took great pride in their ability to prepare dishes using preserved ingredients, showcasing their skill and expertise in the art of medieval cooking. And let's not forget the bizarre ingredients that sometimes found their way into the royal diet. From roasted peacock to swan, the medieval diet was filled with exotic meats that were rarely seen by commoners. But it didn't stop at just the typical birds and beasts. Medieval royals were known to dine on strange delicacies, including dishes made from eels, frogs, and even dormice. Yes, dormice, those little rodents, were considered a delicacy in certain parts of Europe and were often served at banquets as part of the royal spread. Imagine sitting at a grand banquet, sipping wine and enjoying a roasted dormouse. For the royals, it wasn't just about food, it was about prestige, about showcasing their ability to access the most rare and unusual foods. It was a way of demonstrating that they were above the ordinary, able to enjoy the finest things in life, even if those finest things were somewhat offbeat by modern standards. As we continue our exploration of the medieval diet, it becomes clear that food wasn't just about sustenance, was a tool for power, an expression of status, and a reflection of the values and concerns of the time. It was about indulgence, excess, and sometimes even danger. And for the royals, the table was more than just a place to eat. It was a stage for performing wealth, health, and power. As we continue our journey through the medieval royal diet, it's time to talk about one of the most peculiar and oddly essential parts of the medieval meal: fish. You see, fish had a much more important role in medieval life than simply being a choice on a menu. In fact, it was so significant that entire systems were built around it. For the medieval monarchy, especially in countries like England, the consumption of fish wasn't just about dietary preference, it was heavily influenced by religion and law. The church, which was at the center of medieval life, mandated that fish be consumed on specific days, and often those days fell on what we now refer to as meatless days, Fridays, during Lent and other religious holidays. During these fasting periods, meat was strictly forbidden, and fish was the go-to alternative. The idea behind it was simple. While fish were technically an animal, they were not considered meat by the church, and thus allowed. But it wasn't just about avoiding meat. It was about obeying the rules. Eating fish wasn't just a dietary choice, but a religious obligation that had real social and political ramifications. Royals, of course, followed these rules. But as with most things in medieval life, the concept of fish wasn't as straightforward as we think today. Fish wasn't just about convenience or meeting the church's requirements. It also represented a certain level of luxury. The best fish was considered a delicacy, and royalty wasn't eating just any fish. They ate fish that was rare, exotic, or painstakingly preserved. In fact, in some cases, the fish served to royalty wasn't just caught from nearby rivers or lakes. Some of the most prestigious fish came from foreign waters, imported at great expense. Sturgeon, for example, was a prized fish, and it was often salted or pickled to ensure it could be enjoyed year-round. But the royals didn't just limit themselves to the common varieties of fish. They consumed strange delicacies like pickled herring, which was often stored in barrels for long periods of time. But there's a twist. Here, while fish was seen as a delicacy, it wasn't always as fresh as one might expect. The preservation methods, like pickling and salting, while effective, sometimes left the fish tasting far more pungent than what modern diners are accustomed to. So while you're imagining feasts of fresh fish prepared by royal chefs, remember that some of that fish would have been salty, oily, or sometimes sour, as it had been stored for months. In some respects, eating fish was a ritual. For medieval royalty, consuming a certain type of fish wasn't just about the act of eating it, was about demonstrating their connection to the church and, by extension, their piety. It was a reminder that they followed the rules of both the state and the divine. But let's dig deeper, shall we? Fish consumption wasn't only reserved for fasting periods. It was a year-round fixture at the royal table. And let's not forget, the royals didn't just eat fish, they served it in a way that showcased their culinary expertise and status. Fish was often cooked in rich sauces, flavored with exotic spices, and paired with other expensive ingredients. Imagine a grand banquet table where, in addition to meats like venison or roasted boar, you also have delicate fish dishes surrounded by sauces of wine and herbs, garnished with fruits and exotic spices. It's not just dinner, it's a demonstration of wealth, a way of flaunting the far-reaching influence of the monarchy. The royal chefs took great pride in their ability to cook these fish dishes to perfection, creating complex sauces and flavors. That would have delighted the royal court and their guests. But not all fish was quite so refined. Some of the more common folk didn't have access to the rarest fish, and their meals were often far simpler. For them, fish was more of a necessity than a luxury, and it was prepared in the simplest ways possible. Sometimes it was salted and dried, which allowed it to be stored for long periods. Other times it was boiled, and sometimes it was served fresh, depending on the season. The difference between what royalty ate and what the common folk ate is a striking example of how food was used as a means of social distinction. The commoners might have enjoyed fish as a regular part of their diet, but the quality and preparation of that fish were worlds apart from what the royals had at their lavish feasts. Of course, the royals' extravagant fish dishes weren't without controversy. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of fish consumption during medieval times was actually a reflection of religious devotion, or if it was a bit of a power play. After all, the church had a huge influence on the royal court, and by obeying the religious dietary restrictions, the royals were signaling their piety and their devotion to God. But there was a catch. Many of the foods that were consumed in the medieval royal courts weren't just about obedience to religious law, they were also about displaying power. And fish was no exception. The royals had access to the best, most exotic fish, and they used that access to reinforce their status as not just earthly rulers, but divine figures who were in harmony with God's will. Fish wasn't just about sustenance, but about making a statement. As we continue to explore the medieval royal diet, let's also consider the complexity of food preparation during this time. Preparing fish wasn't simply a matter of cooking. it and serving it on a plate. It required intricate methods of preservation, seasoning, and presentation. Cooking fish in medieval Europe wasn't about quickly throwing it in a pan. It was a delicate process that involved knowledge of how to handle different types of fish, whether fresh or preserved. And the royals weren't just serving fish, they were serving it as part of a larger, more elaborate spread. The royal court was all about drama and spectacle, and the way food was presented reflected that. Imagine the grand table, with dozens of dishes, each one competing for attention. At the center of it all, a giant fish dressed with herbs, fruits, and sauces, signaling that the feast had truly begun. Royalty understood that their meals weren't just for sustenance, they were a performance. A grand display of wealth, power, and piety. It wasn't enough to simply eat. It was important to be seen eating well, and fish was just one example of how the royals managed to flaunt their position. But as we wrap up this section, consider this. Fish in the medieval diet wasn't just a food item. It was part of a larger political and religious system that shaped the lives of kings and queens. The fish they ate wasn't just about flavor or health, it was a symbol of their wealth, their devotion, and their understanding of the complex power structures that governed their world. And even today, as we sit down to our meals, there's a trace of that medieval obsession with food as power reminder that what we eat is often more than just about sustenance. As we continue to unravel the intricacies of medieval royalty's diet, we now turn our attention to one of the more unexpected elements of their meals: liquids. You might imagine that kings and queens would start their day with a glass of water, or perhaps a cup of tea, but royalty in the medieval period had a rather peculiar relationship with liquids. Water, the very thing we rely on every day, was often seen as dangerous or contaminated. Imagine that choosing almost anything other than water because it might not be safe to drink. It wasn't unusual for people during the medieval period to suffer from waterborne diseases, as their water sources were often polluted, so they avoided drinking it whenever possible. Instead, what did they reach for? Well, most medieval royalty, as strange as it might sound, preferred ale and wine. Yes, alcohol was their drink of choice, and not just for feasts, but for everyday consumption. It wasn't just a once-a-week treat. These drinks were consumed with nearly every meal. Ale and wine weren't just for the wealthy to indulge in, they were practical solutions to the challenge of drinking safe liquids. The alcohol content helped kill off harmful bacteria in the water, making these beverages a safer choice. Historians still debate whether medieval royalty was simply reacting to their unsafe water sources, or if there was a certain cultural and political significance to their alcohol consumption. Did drinking wine and ale elevate their status, or was it just a way to stay alive? For the medieval royal ale was more than just a casual drink, it was a staple. It wasn't like the beer we enjoy today, either. Medieval ale was a thick, sometimes sour drink, often brewed with barley and flavored with herbs or spices. It was far from the light, crisp beers we're familiar with now. The ale of the time was often dark and rich, and it had a distinct taste, influenced by the brewing methods and the limited variety of ingredients available. This wasn't the type of ale you'd sip on the patio during a hot summer day. No, this ale was a hearty, filling drink that often accompanied breakfast and lunch. It was also much stronger than most modern-day ales. Some medieval ales had such high alcohol content that it could leave you feeling lightheaded after only a few sips. And of course, we can't forget about the wine. Wine, especially red wine, was another drink that ruled the medieval royal table. This wasn't the wine we sipped casually while eating dinner. This wine was strong, sometimes mixed with spices and herbs, and often served with a heavy meal. In fact, wine was so integral to the medieval dining experience that it became a social activity in itself. It wasn't just about drinking, it was about savoring the experience, talking over glasses of wine, and celebrating the connection between food and drink. The importance of wine in the royal diet was further reinforced by the fact that many noble families had vineyards of their own. A good vineyard could be a sign of wealth and influence, and the wine produced from such estates was often considered a luxury item. But here's the real twist. While ale and wine were the preferred drinks, there were also beverages that we would find strange or even off-putting today. One such drink was called hypocras. Hypocras was a spiced wine, often sweetened with sugar or honey, and flavored with a mix of ingredients like cinnamon, ginger, and pepper. It was often served at banquets and feasts, both for its distinct flavor and for its medicinal properties. Yes, even drinks had to be functional. It was believed that hypocras had health benefits, such as aiding digestion, so it wasn't just about the taste, it was about wellness. And while that might sound odd to us today, it was part of the royal approach to food and drink. For them, it wasn't just about satisfying hunger or thirst, it was about maintaining an image, and also making sure their bodies stayed in peak condition, at least according to the medical knowledge of the time. But let's step away from the alcohol for a moment and look at what else medieval royalty might have drunk. You might be surprised to learn that another favored drink of the time was a concoction called posset. Posset was a warm drink made from milk, often mixed with wine or ale, and sometimes flavored with spices like nutmeg and cinnamon. It was a drink that was often consumed at the end of a meal, meant to soothe the stomach after a heavy feast. It sounds like something we might drink today when we're feeling a bit under the weather. But for the royals, it was seen as a treat, often served in elaborate cups at grand dinners. The concept of drinking warm milk might sound foreign to us, but it was considered a comfort drink for the upper class. In fact, some even believed that posset had medicinal properties, especially when it came to soothing the nerves or helping with sleep. And while we might look at these drinks and wonder how they could possibly have been enjoyable for the medieval royals, they represented luxury, comfort, and indulgence. As with all aspects of medieval dining, the drinks consumed by royalty were deeply tied to status and the social structures of the time. You weren't just drinking a cup of wine, you were signaling your position in society. And as we think about these royal beverages, it's impossible to ignore the fact that they were often consumed in great quantities. Remember, a banquet could stretch for hours, and with all that rich food, wine, and ale flowing, the royals had to pace themselves. But sometimes, the wine and ale weren't the only things that were flowing. The medieval feasts were often full of speeches, jokes, and storytelling, making the drinks a vital part of the social atmosphere. There was something about the combination of food, drink, and conversation that made these royal gatherings so essential to the functioning of medieval society. But beyond the social and ceremonial aspects of these drinks, there was something darker lurking in the background. The royals, despite their wealth and lavish banquets, often suffered from health issues related to their alcohol consumption. Gout, a disease caused by the excessive consumption of alcohol and rich foods, was common among the upper classes. It's easy to imagine a king sitting at his table, nursing a glass of wine, all while his feet and hands began to swell from the gout brought on by his indulgence. But even as the royals struggled with their health, they didn't let that stop them. the indulgence continued. Drinking was an essential part of the medieval royal experience, and it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. From the ale that greeted them in the morning to the wine that accompanied their evening meals, liquids were never just about quenching thirst. They were about pleasure, about power, and about socializing. And as we conclude this section, remember that the relationship between medieval royalty and their liquids wasn't just about the drinks themselves, was about the status they conferred, the rituals they sustained, and the indulgence they celebrated. Asterisk. As we continue our exploration into the rich, sometimes perplexing world of medieval royal dining, we now find ourselves delving into one of the more surprising aspects of the medieval diet suites. You might think that the absence of sugar would make desserts rather uninteresting in medieval times, but that's far from the truth. In fact, sweets were just as important to medieval royalty as any savory dish, and what they considered a treat might be far different from what we expect today. In a world where sugar was scarce and expensive, it wasn't something you'd find sprinkled on your cereal or added to every cup of tea. No, sugar was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford, and it was often used for medicinal purposes, rather than simply to sweeten food. But despite the scarcity of sugar, royalty found ways to satisfy their sweet tooth. For example, honey, the most accessible sweetener of the time, was used in abundance. In fact, honey was so prized that it was often used as a form of currency. Medieval chefs and bakers would often substitute honey for sugar in their desserts, creating confections that were thick, rich, and full of complexity. Imagine a medieval honey pie, for instance, baked with fragrant herbs, rich butter, and a touch of honey. The result would be a sweet, comforting dessert that was a far cry from the saccharine treats we enjoy today, but no less indulgent. Another sweet treat that found its way to the royal table was candied fruits. Medieval royalty had access to the finest fruits, many of which were preserved in sugar or honey and served as part of a grand banquet. These candied fruits, often made from figs, dates, and cherries, would be cooked down into a syrupy mixture that coated the fruit, creating a sticky, chewy delight that would have been the perfect ending to a heavy meal. Interestingly, candied fruit wasn't just a way to satisfy the royals' sweet tooth, was also a way of preserving fruit. Without refrigeration, preserving food was a vital skill, and this sugary preservation method allowed fruits to be enjoyed long after they had been harvested. Some medieval sweets, though, were more complex than just honey or candied fruit. Take marzipan, for example. Marzipan, made from ground almonds and sugar, was a delicacy fit for royalty. In fact, marzipan was often molded into elaborate shapes and figures, sometimes resembling animals or even flowers, and served at banquets as a decorative centerpiece. This sweet treat wasn't just about flavor, it was about display. Imagine sitting down to a royal feast, and before you lies a carefully crafted marzipan replica of a castle or a ship, all crafted by a skilled confectioner. It wasn't simply food, it was an art form. But there's a bit of a twist here. While these sweet treats were indeed a display of opulence, they also reflected the medieval mindset of medicine through food. Like many foods consumed by the royalty, sweets were thought to have certain health benefits. Marzipan, for instance, was believed to be a cure for ailments like indigestion, and it was often used as a digestive aid. Similarly, other sweet treats, like candied fruits, were often consumed for their perceived medicinal properties. The blending of culinary indulgence with medicinal practices wasn't just about taste, it was about maintaining health and wellness, or at least attempting to. But let's not get carried away with the idea that medieval sweets were all honey pies and marzipan sculptures. In reality, they were often much simpler, and sometimes rather strange by modern standards. One such dessert was the spiced fruit compote. Made with fruits like apples, pears, and quinces, this dessert was cooked down with sugar and a variety of spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. It was served warm, and its aroma would fill the royal halls, blending with the smells of roasted meats and freshly baked bread. But the real twist here, the use of unusual spices that were thought to have both medicinal and culinary value. Spices like saffron, which was considered both a luxury item and a health remedy, were added to many sweet dishes, and these added complexity to the flavor. The royal tables, laden with such intricate combinations, would have created a symphony of smells, tastes, and textures, truly elevating the experience of dining. But all this indulgence didn't come without its consequences. While sweets might have been a luxury, they were also a potential danger. In an era where medical knowledge was limited, overindulgence in sugar, honey, or any other rich food was often blamed for ailments like tooth decay, obesity, and even diseases like gout. The very sugar that was used to make those elaborate desserts could be causing the royals harm. And yet, the royals continued to indulge. Why? Because indulgence was a symbol of their status. It wasn't about the risks, it was about the display of wealth and power that came with serving luxurious foods, no matter how dangerous they might have been. It wasn't just about satisfying a craving. It was about showing the world that they could afford the finest, most extravagant foods available. The royals' diet, even in its most indulgent moments, was a carefully constructed imager, symbol of wealth, power, and influence. And while we look at these medieval sweets with a sense of fascination, it's important to remember that they weren't just about decadence. They were a reflection of the medieval mindset that food had a purpose beyond mere nourishment. Food was a tool for power, an extension of the ruler's grandeur, and even a way to communicate piety or wellness. As we move forward in our exploration, we'll see that this connection between food and power, indulgence and status, continued to shape the medieval royal diet. From lavish feasts to simple sweets, the royals used their food not just for sustenance, but as a way to reinforce their position in society. It wasn't just about what was on the table, it was about what that food said about the person sitting at the head of the table. And with every bite, the royals solidified their place as rulers not only of lands, but of a society built around wealth, excess, and indulgence. Asterisk. As we venture further into the bizarre world of medieval royal dining, let's now turn our attention to the truly outlandish and often bizarre dishes that graced the royal table. You may have already imagined grand feasts of roasted meats, delicate sweets, and lavish drinks. But what if I told you that some of the medieval royalty's most cherished dishes involved creatures and ingredients that might make your stomach churn? That's right, royalty often dined on what we might consider strange and, in some cases, downright unappetizing dishes. Let's start with one of the most peculiar items on the royal menu, eels. Yes, you heard that right, eels were considered a delicacy in medieval Europe. These slippery creatures were often prepared in pies or stews, spiced with herbs and flavored with rich broths. But the concept of eating eels wasn't just about tasted, was also tied to religion. For the church, eels were considered fish, so they were allowed on fasting days when meat was forbidden. And the royalty didn't just eat eels because they were permitted during religious observances, they actually enjoyed them. Eels were often cooked in such a way that they would take on a rich, aromatic flavor, often paired with other meats or seafood. While today, many of us might shy away from such a dish, for the medieval aristocracy, eating eels was a sign of luxury and sophistication, especially when prepared by a skilled chef. But eels weren't the only strange food to grace the royal table. Another such dish, which might make you rethink your idea of a grand feast, was roasted peacock. Yes, peacock. In fact, it wasn't just about eating the bird, it was about presenting it in the most extravagant way possible. When served at a royal banquet, the peacock would often be roasted whole, and sometimes it was presented in its most dramatic form, feathers intact. The bird would be arranged in such a way that the feathers were spread out around it, creating a stunning visual spectacle that left guests in awe. But it wasn't just about the visual. The taste of roasted peacock, though rare, was something the royals savored. The meat itself was gamey, and its flavor was often complemented with rich, sweet sauces. It's said that the peacock was often served at the end of a meal as a symbol of the end of the feast, capping off an evening of indulgence and excess. Imagine sitting at the table, surrounded by nobles, as the roasted peacock is brought in, feathers fanned out like an extravagant crown. It wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about making a statement. Then there were the dishes that we might consider truly exotic, like swans. Swans were another bird that appeared regularly at the medieval royal table. In fact, they were often kept by the royalty, and in some cases, swan meat was considered a rare delicacy that would be served only on the most special occasions. The meat of the swan was dark, rich, and somewhat fatty, making it perfect for roasting or stewing. But the swan wasn't just about eating. Much like the peacock, it was a symbol of power and extravagance. The sight of a royal feast, complete with roasted swan, spoke volumes about the wealth and influence of the host. But the most shocking part? In some royal courts, swans were considered property. As you heard me right, the monarchs would own the swans, and anyone caught killing or eating one without permission could face severe punishment. The swan wasn't just a food item, it was a symbol of ownership, control, and prestige. As you can imagine, these extravagant dishes weren't for the common folk. They were reserved for the highest levels of society, and they served as a reminder of the vast divide between royalty and the peasantry. While the common folk might have been struggling to make do with basic grains and vegetables, the royals were indulging in a banquet of birds, fish, and rich, luxurious foods. It's important to note, though, that these extravagant meals weren't just about eating for the sake of sustenance. They were about power. The food served at these royal banquets was a demonstration of the wealth and status of the ruling class. Each dish, whether it was a roasted peacock or a game bird like swan or pheasant, was a way of showing off what the king or queen could afford. And let's not forget about the guests. Royal banquets weren't just about the monarch enjoying their meal, they were an opportunity to display one's grandeur in front of a room full of nobility. It was a performance, a spectacle. The presence of such outlandish dishes was part of that spectacle. Can you imagine the shock and awe that would sweep through the room when a whole roasted peacock was brought to the table? It wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was about creating an experience, a memory that would linger in the minds of the guests. But the medieval royal table wasn't just about extravagant birds and meats. Some of the dishes could be downright strange. Take, for instance, a dish called pasty, a kind of pie filled with all sorts of bizarre ingredients. Some pasties included things like oysters, fish, or even rabbit, all encased in a thick pastry shell. It wasn't just about the food inside it, it was about how the dish was presented. The pasty was often designed to be eaten with the hands, and guests would tear into the pastry shell to reveal the contents inside. It was a meal that combined both practicality and theatre. The rich, complex flavors and the dramatic presentation were designed to impress. You might also find strange combinations on the royal table that would never make it into modern kitchens. Take, for example, spiced meat pies, which could include combinations of meats like pork and beef, often flavored with aromatic spices like cinnamon and cloves. These flavors, though unique, were part of the medieval royal culinary tradition. Using sweet and savory ingredients together was a common theme in medieval cuisine. The result was a complex flavor profile that might have seemed strange at first, but would have been considered a mark of sophistication and refinement at the time. So, as we look back at the medieval royal diet, it becomes clear that food was never just about sustenance. It was about spectacle, about displaying wealth and power. The strange dishes served at royal banquets were just another way for royalty to demonstrate their control over both their court and the land. And while we may look at these strange and extravagant foods with a sense of awe or even disbelief, it's important to remember that for the medieval royals, food wasn't just nourishment. It was a symbol of their place in the world, of their power, and of their legacy. And as we continue to explore the medieval diet, we'll find that the line between indulgence and necessity was always blurred, with food being used to shape not only the bodies of those who ate it, but also the society around them. Now that we've explored the extravagant and often bizarre foods that made up medieval royal banquets, let's take a step back and look at the simpler, more utilitarian side of the royal diet, because while the royals were indulging in luxurious feasts, they weren't immune to the challenges of feeding large populations, including themselves. The truth is, even the most opulent medieval courts had to deal with the realities of food preservation, scarcity, and practicality. Medieval monarchs didn't always have access to fresh food, especially in the colder months when agriculture was slower and the food supply was limited. That's where preservation techniques came in, and let me tell you, these methods were often as complicated and strange as some of the foods they were preserving. Let's start with one of the oldest and most essential methods, salting. Salt, often considered a treasure in medieval times, was used not only to season food, but also to preserve it. The royals, who had the means to access large quantities of salt, would often preserve fish, meat, and even fruits in salt to keep them edible throughout the long winters. Salted beef, for instance, would become a staple during times when fresh meat wasn't available. The same went for fish, like cod or herring. These salted fish would last much longer than fresh catches, allowing them to be enjoyed throughout the year, even during times when fishing was impossible. However, eating salted food wasn't just about practicality, it had a taste all its own. The meat would often become dry and tough, and the flavor was much saltier than what we're used to today. This technique was widespread, and it wasn't just for the royals. Commoners also relied on salted foods to get through the winter months. But salting wasn't the only method of preservation. Smoking was another popular technique used to extend the life of meats, especially poultry. Roasted meats, including game birds like pheasants and partridges, would be smoked over low fires to keep them from spoiling. The process infused the meat with a smoky flavor, which would become a signature taste of medieval banquets. Imagine sitting at the royal table with platters of smoked pheasant, the rich aroma of the meat blending with the spices on the table. It wasn't just a meal, it was a sensory experience. But let's move on to another method of food preservation: drying. Dried fruits and vegetables were a common feature of the medieval diet. Just as today we dry tomatoes and herbs for preservation, the medieval royals would dry apples, pears, and other fruits to keep them available year-round. The drying process was simple. Fruits would be sliced, laid out in the sun, and allowed to dry out, often before being packed away in jars or barrels. The same method was used for herbs, which were dried to preserve their flavor and medicinal properties. Dried fruits were a common sight on the royal table, often served as snacks, or incorporated into sweet dishes. These dried fruits were sometimes soaked in wine or honey to enhance their flavor, making them a sweet and tangy treat for the royals. The method of drying wasn't just a practical means of preserving food, it was a way to create exotic dishes. Since dried fruits could be transported long distances without spoiling, medieval chefs, skilled in the art of preservation, would often combine dried fruits with fresh ingredients to create unique dishes that impressed both the taste buds and the eyes. In addition to dried fruits, another common preservation method was the use of vinegar. Pickling vegetables in vinegar or brine was a technique used by both the wealthy and the common folk. The pickled vegetables, often served as condiments or side dishes, added a tangy contrast to the rich meats and heavy stews served at the royal table. Pickled onions, cucumbers, and other vegetables were a frequent accompaniment to meals, providing a refreshing bite amidst the heaviness of roasted meats and rich sauces. In fact, pickled foods were so popular in medieval Europe that entire industries grew around their production. Vinegar was also used in the creation of sauces, which were an essential part of medieval cuisine. Sauces, often made with vinegar, wine, and spices, were used to flavor everything from meats to fish, and the royals had access to the most refined versions. These sauces would often be thickened with breadcrumbs or almonds, giving them a rich, creamy texture that paired perfectly with the heavy dishes on the table. But the story of preservation in the medieval diet isn't just about salt, smoke, and drying. It's also about the need to create meals that could be consumed throughout the year. The medieval calendar was built around the changing seasons, with feasts and fasting periods corresponding to agricultural cycles. In the summer months, fresh produce was abundant, and the royal tables would be filled with fresh vegetables, fruits, and dairy products. But in the winter, fresh food became scarce, and preservation techniques took over. This reliance on preservation meant that the medieval royals were constantly navigating the tension between indulgence and necessity. While their tables were often overflowing with extravagant dishes, they were also rooted in a system of careful planning, where food had to be preserved for the long months ahead. The ability to preserve food was essential for the survival of the monarchy, and for maintaining the extravagant feasts that marked their power. Despite the lavish spread of roasted meats, fine pastries, and exotic spices, medieval dining was not without its limitations. Freshness was often sacrificed in favor of longevity, and the ability to preserve foods was one of the keys to maintaining royal feasts throughout the year. And let's not forget that while the royals dined in luxury, they weren't immune to the consequences of these preservation methods. The heavy reliance on salted, smoked, and dried foods meant that many meals were high in salt and fat, which would lead to health issues like gout. Even though medieval royalty had access to the best chefs and the finest ingredients, their diets were not always the healthiest. The excessive consumption of preserved meats, coupled with the lavish use of spices and sauces often led to health problems. It's almost poetic when you think about it. The very foods that were meant to demonstrate wealth and power often came with a hidden cost to the royals' health. In many ways, the medieval royal diet reflects the paradox of medieval life itself. Indulgence and excess, paired with the harsh realities of survival. While the royals dined on the finest foods, their meals were also shaped by the same challenges faced by commoners: food preservation, scarcity, and the need to prepare for the lean months ahead. In the end, food in medieval Europe wasn't just about what was eaten, it was about what it represented. The lavish feasts, the strange and exotic dishes, and the complex preservation methods all served as a reminder of the divide between the royal classes and the common folk. The royal diet, with all its richness and complexity, was as much a tool for power as it was a reflection of the time in which it was created. And as we continue to explore the fascinating world of medieval feasts, remember that these meals were not just about food. They were a performance and expression of wealth, power, and status. Asterisk. Now that we've explored the extravagant feasts, strange delicacies, and preservation techniques of the medieval royal diet, it's time to address one of the most fundamental aspects of medieval eating: the simplicity and hardship that defined the meals of the common folk. While the royal courts were overflowing with exotic dishes, roasted meats, and elaborate sweets, the majority of people, peasants and lower classes, didn't have the luxury of such indulgences. Instead, their meals were defined by necessity, resourcefulness, and the seasons. The medieval diet for commoners was simple, seasonal, and heavily reliant on grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables or fruits were in season. Imagine for a moment what a typical meal would have looked like for someone in the lower classes. Chances are, it would be some form of potager, thick, hearty stew made from whatever grains were available, such as oats, barley, or rye. Pottage was a staple of medieval peasant life. This dish, often prepared in a large pot over a fire, was made by boiling grains with water or broth, adding a few vegetables like onions, carrots, and cabbage, and sometimes including legumes like beans or peas. If the household was fortunate, they might be able to throw in some small pieces of salted pork or chicken. But meat wasn't a regular part of the diet for the majority of commoners. The scarcity of fresh meat was one of the defining characteristics of peasant life. Meat was expensive and difficult to obtain, so it wasn't a daily indulgence. Instead, commoners relied on their small farms for a steady supply of vegetables and grains, which formed the basis of their diet. Even though their meals were humble, there was a certain wisdom in the way they used what they had. Vegetables like cabbage, leeks, onions, and peas were not just nutritious, they were inexpensive and hardy, able to withstand the colder months. Root vegetables, including turnips, carrots, and parsnips, were often included in pottage and stews. These vegetables, along with the occasional piece of salted or smoked meat, provided a caloric base that allowed peasants to get through the long, labor-intensive days in the fields. The seasonal nature of medieval diets meant that food would change with the seasons, and the meals of commoners were often dictated by what was available at any given time. In the spring and summer months, peasants would have access to fresh greens, herbs, and fruits like apples and berries. These would be eaten raw or used to flavor the potages and stews. But when winter arrived, fresh food became scarce. Commoners would rely on preserved vegetables, dried meats, and any root vegetables they had stored from the fall harvest One surprising aspect of the medieval diet of the common folk is how little they had to rely on spices. While the royal courts had access to exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron, the common folk had to make do with much simpler flavorings. Salt was one of the most important seasonings they could afford, and herbs like parsley, sage, and thyme were grown in small herb gardens or gathered from the wild. The peasants weren't completely without indulgence, however. While they didn't have access to the luxurious feasts of royalty, they still found ways to enjoy small treats, especially on holidays or feast days. For example, they would sometimes make simple fruit pies or cakes, using what little sugar they could afford, often honey and fruit from their orchards or wild berries, while the peasants might have occasionally dined on simple fruit-filled pastries or small game. These were rare exceptions, not regular occurrences. To make up for the lack of meat, peasants often turned to dairy products. Milk, cheese, and butter were commonly produced on small farms and added a nutritional element to their meals. Cheese, especially hard cheeses, was a key component of the medieval diet for commoners, as it could be stored and preserved for long periods. Butter was also used for cooking, though it wasn't as luxurious as it might seem. While butter in royal courts would be used in rich sauces and pastries, commoners used it as a way to enrich the flavor of otherwise simple meals. Dairy was a vital protein source in a peasant's diet, and it was often the closest thing to meat that they could afford. The daily life of a medieval peasant was defined by hard work and resourcefulness. Most commoners worked long hours in the fields, tending to crops or livestock. Their diet reflected this hard labor, as their meals needed to be filling and caloric to support such demanding physical work. Even so, they didn't enjoy the lavish variety that royalty took for granted. Their food was simple, but it was also practical. It was food that kept them alive, nourished, and capable of performing the labor required for the survival of the community. The feasts that we associate with medieval royalty were rare for most people, but the sense of community and ritual around meals was very much alive in the everyday life of peasants. Meals were often eaten together, and food was a way of maintaining bonds within the household or village. Even without the extravagant dishes that the royalty enjoyed, food remained central to the social fabric of medieval life. But let's not romanticize peasant food entirely. The reality was that the lower classes often had to face hunger and malnutrition. Famine was a very real risk for peasants, especially during harsh winters or poor harvests. The medieval period was rife with famines, and commoners often went without food, relying on whatever scraps or preserved items they could get their hands on. Bread, often made from rye or barley, was the staple of the peasant diet, but there were times when even bread became a luxury. The price of grain could fluctuate, and during times of bad harvests or high demand, bread became scarce. The concept of food security, as we understand it today, didn't exist. People lived at the mercy of the seasons, and the quality and quantity of their food depended heavily on the weather. As a result, hunger was an ever-present part of life for many peasants. Despite these hardships, food in the medieval peasant's life was never purely about sustenance. It also played a role in the social and cultural life of the community. Festivals, holidays, and religious events often marked times of abundance, and special meals would be prepared for these occasions. The simple joy of coming together for a shared meal was just as important for commoners as it was for royalty, even if the food itself was much more humble. In conclusion, the medieval diet of royalty and commoners was as different as night and day. while the royalty feasted on rich meats, sweet pastries, and exotic spices. The peasants made do with humble pottage, preserved vegetables, and dairy. However, both diets reflected the needs and realities of their respective classes. The royal diet was about excess, display, and power, while the peasant diet was about survival, practicality, and resourcefulness. But at the heart of both diets was the same simple truth. Food was more than just nourishment. It was a symbol, a ritual, and an essential part of life, no matter who you were. Asterisk. As we move deeper into the heart of medieval royal dining, it's important to address one of the most defining and sometimes troubling aspects of medieval life: the influence of the Black Death on the royal diet. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, was a devastating plague that killed an estimated 1/3 of the population. The impact of this plague was not limited to the living conditions of commoners or the fear that gripped the continent. It also had a profound effect on the food supply and, consequently, on the royal diet. Imagine being a king or queen in the midst of such a calamity while you're cloistered away in your royal castle, surrounded by servants and protection. There's no escaping the reality that the entire food system is collapsing. The effect of the plague on agriculture was immediate. As millions of people died, farmland was left untended, and entire villages were abandoned. Crops that would normally be harvested were left to rot in the fields, and there were widespread shortages of grains, vegetables, and other food staples. This created a ripple effect that affected both the common folk and the wealthy alike. For royalty, the Black Death didn't mean that their grand feasts would end immediately. After all, they had the means to procure food from distant lands, and wealthy suppliers and their servants were still able to bring in food from surrounding areas. But there was no doubt that the quality and variety of food began to suffer. Historians still argue whether the Black Death led to a permanent shift in the way royals ate. But one thing is certain: the lavish, indulgent meals that had once been the hallmark of the royal court became more difficult to maintain. Some royal courts, particularly those in Italy and France, faced shortages of the most prized ingredients. Imported spices and luxury foods became harder to come by as trade routes were disrupted by the plague. This meant that spices like saffron, cinnamon, and pepper, which had once been essential to creating the rich, flavorful dishes the royals loved, were suddenly unavailable, at least far more expensive. As a result, some royal kitchens were forced to adjust their menus. While meat continued to be a staple at the royal table, the availability of exotic meats like venison, boar, and wild birds became limited, and the quality of these meats suffered. Even fish, which had once been preserved and shipped from distant shores, was harder to obtain. But the royals were not without their ingenuity. As trade networks began to break down, the wealthy elite began to focus on more locally sourced food. Even though these local foods weren't nearly as exotic or luxurious as what they were accustomed to. Instead of exotic birds or imported spices, royal banquets started to feature more local meats, including beef, mutton, and pork. In some regions, venison was still a prized dish, but it was no longer as available as it had been before the plague. This shift in diet also meant that the complex sauces and extravagant dishes that characterized medieval feasts began to change. While there were still elaborate meals served at royal banquets, they were becoming simpler, less reliant on imported goods, and more focused on what could be grown or raised in local gardens and farms. Interestingly, the plague's effect on the royal diet also gave rise to a growing interest in simpler foods. In times of crisis, people tend to return to basics, and the royalty were no different. Even in the midst of their grand palaces, they turned to more sustainable and nourishing meals, reflecting the shifting priorities of the time. For example, grain-based meals like pottage, once a staple of the lower classes, became more common. On the royal table, the use of beans, peas, and root vegetables became more widespread, as these were hardy crops that could be grown even during times of scarcity. Some royal kitchens even began to focus more on vegetarian meals, which were considered healthier and less reliant on the external trade routes that had been disrupted by the plague. The Black Death also had a dramatic effect on the consumption of alcohol at royal feasts. Prior to the plague, alcohol, particularly wine and ale, was consumed in great quantities. But as the plague spread and the food supply became more unpredictable, alcohol consumption also began to decrease. The royal kitchens, which had once been stocked with the finest wines from France, Italy, and Spain, started to face shortages of their favorite vintage. The royals, still accustomed to the indulgence of lavish banquets, now had to settle for more modest, locally sourced beverages. But as with the food supply, the royals adapted. Wine and ale were replaced with new, simpler drinks made from herbs, fruits, and honey. These drinks, which were often fermented or brewed locally, became popular alternatives to the expensive wines and ales that had once been the centerpieces of royal dining. There's even evidence to suggest that the royalty, in their desperation to keep the festive atmosphere of their feasts alive, began to focus on the presentation of food rather than the variety. Even though the available ingredients were fewer, the art of meal presentation, arranging food in intricate patterns and shapes, displaying it in silver and gold dishes, continued to be a way for royalty to signal their status and wealth. This continued emphasis on the presentation of food was an important part of medieval royal life, as meals were as much about display as they were about consumption. Banquets, in particular, remained grand affairs, even though the menus had become more practical. The royals used food as a means of reinforcing their place at the top of the social hierarchy. And despite the challenges posed by the Black Death, the idea of a grand banquet remained central to their identity. However, the plague didn't just affect the food on the table, it also had lasting effects on the way royals thought about food. With the widespread death and disease, many began to see food not just as a luxury, but as a vital resource that needed to be protected and preserved. The royal kitchens began to take greater care in how they sourced, stored, and prepared food, learning valuable lessons about sustainability and resource management. These changes were not just about surviving the Black Death, they were about ensuring that the royal courts could continue to function and thrive in a world that had been irrevocably altered. In the years following the plague, the royal diet began to recover, but the lessons learned during the crisis continued to shape the way food was treated at royal banquets. The more extravagant feasts would return, but they would never be quite the same. The lavishness of the past had been tempered by the sobering realities of disease and scarcity, and food was no longer just a tool for indulgence and display. It had become a symbol of survival, resilience, and adaptability. Looking back on this period, we see that the Black Death not only changed the lives of the common folk, but also reshaped the very foundations of royal dining. It was a reminder that no matter how rich or powerful you were never fully insulated from the forces of nature, scarcity, and disease. As we continue to explore the shifting tides of the medieval royal diet, it's impossible to ignore the rise of new culinary trends and practices that emerged in the wake of the Black Death. as well as the impact of social, political, and cultural shifts that redefined what and how royalty ate. In the aftermath of the plague, the very foundations of medieval society were shaken, and the royal court had to adapt to a new, harsher world. The monarchs, once surrounded by an almost unimaginable abundance of food, found themselves facing the realities of scarcity and rationing. While the royal courts were still able to maintain their lavish meals, the focus on indulgence began to shift. No longer were kings and queens just enjoying exotic dishes and indulgent sweets. They were now more concerned with creating meals that not only celebrated their power, but also reflected the new frugality of the post-plague world. The most immediate change in the royal diet came in the form of a greater reliance on local and seasonal ingredients. Gone were the days when fresh produce, exotic meats, and luxurious spices could be easily imported from faraway lands. In their place, the royal kitchens started focusing on what was available locally: fruits, vegetables, and meats that could be raised or grown on the royal estates. This shift marked the beginning of a return to simplicity. While the royalty still feasted on fine meats, elaborate dishes became fewer and fewer, and meals became more centered around the earthy flavors of what could be found nearby. The use of game, poultry, and local beef or lamb became more common, while foods like exotic fish or meats from distant lands became rarities. This return to local foods was not only a practical response to the changing economic realities of the time, but also a reflection of changing tastes. The lavish use of foreign spices, once a hallmark of royal dining, became less frequent, as both the cost and the availability of spices skyrocketed. Spices like saffron, cinnamon, and nutmeg, once accessible to the wealthiest monarchs, became prohibitively expensive, and so royal chefs started experimenting with locally grown herbs and seasonings, which gave rise to new flavor profiles. Herbs like parsley, thyme, rosemary, and sage became the stars of many dishes, offering the same depth of flavor without the extravagant cost. These herbs were easier to obtain, and their bold, fragrant flavors provided a satisfying alternative to the distant spices that had once been a royal standard. Along with the shift in ingredients, the post-plague royal diet also saw a change in how meals were prepared and presented. In the past, the royal court had focused on grand displays of wealth and excess, where multiple courses of meat, rich sauces, and extravagant sweets would be served. But now, a more restrained approach took hold. Banquets were still held, but they were no longer about showing off the wealth of the monarchy through indulgence. Instead, they focused on the artistry of the meal itself, the combination of flavors, the balance of textures, and the presentation of local, simple ingredients in ways that made them feel luxurious. Royal chefs had to adjust to this new mindset, creating dishes that were simple in their ingredients, but rich in flavor. The art of garnishing, once reserved for the extravagant, became more of a focus. Vegetables, often the most humble of ingredients, were prepared in such a way that they seemed luxurious. Cabbages, root vegetables, and peas were transformed into delicate soups, stews, and side dishes that rivaled the opulent dishes of old. Despite the shift toward simplicity and practicality, however, the royal court still retained its sense of ritual and celebration. Feast days, religious holidays, and royal occasions still called for extravagant meals, though now these meals were often more centered around symbolic meaning than sheer excess. For instance, fish, which had once been considered a luxury and a symbol of piety, became more important than ever during religious feasts. It was no longer just about the rarity of the fish itself, but about its symbolic connection to the Christian faith. Meals during holidays like Lent or Easter often featured fish as a reminder of the faith's teachings. The religious significance of food also led to a rise in more vegetarian meals, as the royal court began to embrace simpler, more sustainable diets. The influence of monastic practices became more pronounced. Monks and nuns, who had long championed a vegetarian diet based on the belief in moderation and asceticism, began to inspire the nobility. In fact, some royals, like King Henry IV of England, even adopted vegetarian habits for health reasons or spiritual beliefs. These royals embraced a diet rich in vegetables, grains, and legumes, and their meals were often designed to align with the Christian calendar and its religious fasting periods, while many of the more extravagant feasts had given way to these simpler meals. The royal court did not fully abandon indulgence. Instead, indulgence was redefined. The lavish displays of food were now reserved for specific occasions, such as weddings, royal birthdays, or diplomatic gatherings, when foreign dignitaries would be present. These meals still involved multiple courses, but the focus shifted away from lavish excess and toward the strategic use of food to impress and strengthen political alliances. But while the post-plague royal court turned to more sustainable and localized food, they were not immune to the broader cultural shift toward health and wellness. The obsession with health and diet that arose in the wake of the plague became an integral part of the royal approach to food. This was the beginning of an era in which food was no longer solely about indulgence or power. It was about the body's well-being. The growing concern with hygiene, cleanliness, and food safety, which arose after the plague, began to influence the way food was prepared and consumed. Royal kitchens, once chaotic and messy, were now subject to higher standards of cleanliness, and the emphasis on healthy eating slowly grew in the royal court as the health of the monarchy became a matter of public importance. Kings and queens were no longer just concerned with maintaining the outward appearance of power. They were also starting to care about the internal health of their bodies. This shift in focus meant that, for the first time, nutrition began to be recognized as a serious factor in how royals approached food. Fresh fruits and vegetables, once considered mere side dishes, began to be seen as essential to maintaining a balanced diet. Dairy, too, became more important, with butter and cheese appearing more frequently on the royal table. The medieval royal diet, once marked by excess, now included a surprising amount of balance and practicality. Even though they had the luxury of access to the best food available, the monarchs had to adjust their expectations and preferences in light of the changing world. The grand banquets and opulent feasts were not entirely gone, but they were no longer the center of medieval royal life. The simplicity and sustainability of the post-plague diet left its mark on the way food was prepared and consumed at the royal court, reflecting a world in which indulgence had to give way to the realities of survival. And perhaps most importantly, it marked the beginning of the royal recognition that food was not just about luxury or power, but about health, balance, and nourishment. As the centuries progressed, these changes in diet would influence the culinary practices of European courts and shape the future of royal dining. As we continue to reflect on the evolution of the medieval royal diet, we now shift focus to a less glamorous but fascinating aspect of royal dining: the social and political implications of food. Throughout history, food has never simply been about nourishment. It has been an integral part of power, status, and social hierarchy. In medieval Europe, the act of eating was a public spectacle, and the royal dining table was as much a stage for performing authority and power as it was a place to consume food. From the lavish banquets hosted by kings and queens to the more subdued, yet still lavish, meals shared with visiting dignitaries, food played an essential role in showcasing the power of the monarchy. At the center of these royal meals was the idea that the monarch, through their food and feasts, had the ability to shape the perceptions of their rule, both among their subjects and foreign visitors. In fact, food was one of the most powerful tools a medieval ruler had to demonstrate their wealth and control. The display of abundant large quantities of meat, expensive spices, exotic fruits, and rich desserts was not merely for the benefit of the guests. It was a way for monarchs to assert their dominance. A grand feast could communicate a sense of power, control, and prosperity that went beyond the meal itself. It was a message to both the nobility and the common people that their ruler had access to resources, wealth, and luxury that could not be rivaled. And when kings and queens hosted foreign dignitaries, food played an even more crucial role. The royal banquets were an opportunity for monarchs to not only show off their culinary wealth but also to display their political influence. In a time when diplomacy was often conducted through lavish ceremonies and symbolic gestures, the royal dining table became the perfect setting for striking deals, forming alliances, and cementing relationships with other countries. A meal at the royal table wasn't just about sharing food, it was about sharing power. Imagine a visiting ambassador from a foreign court being welcomed into a grand hall, where a feast of roasted boar, pheasant, and spiced wines awaited. The luxurious spread wasn't simply about satisfying hunger. It was an opportunity for the king or queen to assert their superiority. At the same time, the quality and quantity of food served to the guests served as a silent message about the host's generosity and hospitality. Royals were expected to outdo one another in their lavish displays of wealth, and food became a key tool in this one-upmanship. But the significance of food wasn't limited to what was served at royal banquets, also extended to the rituals and etiquette surrounding meals, the seating arrangements, the order in which food was served, and the behavior expected of diners all reinforced the social order. The royal dining table was a place where one's status was clearly defined. The monarch, of course, sat at the head of the table, while guests were assigned places according to their rank and importance. Certain courtiers or noble families might even be granted the honor of sitting closest to the monarch, a sign of their privileged position within the court. The arrangement of seats at the table could shift with the monarch's political whims, serving as a visual reminder of shifting power dynamics. But what was served and how it was served also spoke volumes about the relationships between royal families and the courts they ruled. The act of sharing a meal was a means of building relationships and solidifying allegiances. The food itself often carried symbolic weight. For instance, fish, particularly on fasting days or religious holidays, was not only a pious food but also a symbol of religious devotion. Meat, on the other hand, was often seen as a more luxurious and celebratory option, representing abundance and earthly pleasures. The use of certain foods at particular events also had political ramifications. Take, for example, the importance of bread. For medieval royalty, bread was not just a staple of everyday meals, it was also a symbol of the monarch's duty to provide for their people. A good, healthy loaf of bread represented the kingdom's prosperity and the monarch's ability to sustain their subjects. Conversely, if bread was scarce or of poor quality. It could signify a failure in governance, potentially undermining the monarch's authority. Food also held religious significance, especially within the royal court. The church had a strong influence on the dietary choices of the royals, especially when it came to fasting. Religious observances dictated when and what the royals could eat, and food became an expression of piety and devotion. Royalty was expected to follow these religious rules, which were often strictly enforced by the church. But the church's influence on royal dining went beyond mere fasting. Certain foods, like fish, were associated with religious rituals, particularly during important holy days. The idea that a monarch's behavior at the table was a reflection of their piety and morality was not lost on the public. The feasts and banquets that took place within the royal court were not only important occasions for entertainment and diplomacy, they were also a demonstration of the monarch's faith and adherence to the laws of God. The royal dining table, then, was a place where political, social, and religious messages were sent with each course. But despite all this symbolism, the reality of royal dining was far from perfect. While the court may have been full of riches and abundance, it was also fraught with competition, backstabbing, and power struggles. The act of dining in the royal court often involved a level of politicking. Courtiers would use banquets as opportunities to vie for favor, impress the monarch, and solidify their status within the court. A strategically placed guest, for instance, might use the opportunity of a banquet to secure an alliance with the monarch or advance their own ambitions. Likewise, royals would sometimes use the act of serving food or drinks to reinforce their political and social superiority. The preparation of meals also took on political significance. The royal kitchens, and those who ran them, were essential to the royal court's operations. The kitchen staff, including chefs, stewards, and servants, played critical roles in ensuring that food was plentiful and properly prepared. The importance of the kitchen, and by extension the staff, should not be underestimated in understanding how royal dining reflected the structure of the monarchy. The kitchens themselves became hubs of influence, with the head chef sometimes enjoying a level of power in court politics, as their culinary choices had the potential to elevate or damage the reputation of the monarchy. The food that came from these kitchens was a reflection of the monarch's ability to maintain control and ensure the satisfaction of their guests, both in terms of taste and politics. And while we may look at medieval royal feasts with a sense of awe, marveling at their extravagant displays, it's essential to remember that food was never just about the luxury of the ruling class. It was also about control, communication, and the subtle art of influence. The very meals that were consumed were also the instruments of power. Royalty used food not only to feed their guests, but to shape how they were perceived, both within their kingdom and on the global stage. Ultimately, the royal diet was much more than just food. It was an essential tool in the performance of power, and as the centuries passed, the influence of food on royal politics would continue to shape not just the courtly tables of Europe, but also the very nature of monarchy itself. Asterisk. As we look back on the medieval royal diet, it's impossible to ignore the long-lasting impact that this era's eating habits had on the development of European cuisine. The medieval period laid the foundations for many of the culinary traditions that would emerge in the Renaissance and beyond. Although the medieval royal diet was marked by excess and opulence, it also featured a certain practicality and creativity that would shape future cooking practices. The use of spices, herbs, and preserved foods often seen as luxuries in the royal courts, would become common ingredients in later culinary traditions, and the royal kitchens, with their elaborate feasts and diverse food preparations, helped establish many of the techniques that would define European cooking for centuries. The medieval royal kitchens were a breeding ground for innovation in food preparation. While much of medieval cooking relied on simple techniques like roasting, boiling, and baking, the sheer variety of dishes prepared in royal courts required cooks to experiment with new methods and presentations. The rise of elaborate feasts in the royal courts created the need for a new level of sophistication in kitchen operations. The chefs who worked in royal kitchens were often highly trained and specialized in various aspects of cooking, from meat preparation to pastry making. The increasing demand for variety and creativity in meals led to a greater appreciation for the art of food presentation. Plating food in visually appealing ways became just as important as the flavors themselves, and the presentation of food at royal feasts became a form of visual storytelling. Dishes were often served in intricate designs, with meats arranged in elaborate shapes, pastries adorned with delicate patterns, and sauces used to create eye-catching effects. This attention to detail was a precursor to the sophisticated presentation, styles that would later be perfected in the Renaissance kitchens of Europe. At the same time, medieval royal cooking was also a reflection of the socio-political climate. The royal diet, steeped in symbolism, was a constant reminder of the divide between the elite and the commoners. While royalty indulged in exotic meats, luxurious spices, and lavish desserts, the common people often ate simple meals based on grains, legumes, and vegetables. The disparity between these two diets reinforced the social hierarchy, with food acting as a clear symbol of class and status. Royal meals were designed not only to nourish, but also to reinforce the power dynamics of medieval society. However, the evolution of the royal diet was not just about indulgence and excess. It was also shaped by a growing awareness of health and nutrition. While medieval people had little understanding of modern nutrition, the royal court began to experiment with foods that were believed to promote good health. During this period, there was a growing interest in medicinal foods ingredients that were thought to have healing properties. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and saffron, for example, were used not just for flavor, but for their purported health benefits. These spices were believed to aid digestion, improve circulation, and even prevent illness. The idea that food could have medicinal properties would continue to evolve, influencing the development of European culinary practices in later centuries. The royal diet also influenced the foods that became staples in European cuisine. For example, the popularity of grains like wheat, barley, and rye in medieval royal kitchens helped solidify the foundation for future European bread-making traditions. The medieval obsession with meat, particularly beef and pork, also had a lasting effect on European cuisine, influencing the development of charcuterie and other meat preservation methods. Furthermore, the use of dairy products like butter, cheese, and milk, which was common in the royal kitchens, became increasingly important in the diet of ordinary people, leading to the widespread popularity of dairy products in European cooking. The emergence of elaborate royal feasts, featuring multiple courses and a wide variety of dishes, also set the stage for the development of the modern banquet. By the late medieval period, royal courts were hosting feasts that could last for hours, with several courses served in succession. These feasts were often accompanied by entertainment, music, and performance, turning meals into grand spectacles that showcased the wealth and power of the monarchy. This tradition would carry over into the Renaissance, where feasts and banquets would continue to play a central role in royal court life. But not all the changes in royal dining were purely about luxury. The medieval royal diet was also shaped by the practical need for food security. Monarchs were keenly aware of the importance of maintaining a steady supply of food, not just for the palace, but for the kingdom as a whole. During times of war, famine, or political unrest, the royal court would often stockpile food to ensure that they had enough supplies to last through difficult times. The importance of food preservation during these times cannot be overstated. Salt, drying, smoking, and pickling were all methods used to ensure that food could be stored for long periods, ensuring that the royal family could endure through times of hardship. These preservation methods would later influence the way food was stored and prepared in Europe, especially in the early modern period. As the medieval period came to a close and the Renaissance began, the royal diet began to shift once again. With the rise of exploration and the expansion of trade routes, the availability of new ingredients from the Americas and other parts of the world began to change the landscape of royal dining. Foods like tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, and sugar began to make their way into European kitchens, transforming the culinary traditions of the time. The Renaissance saw a resurgence of luxury in royal dining, but it was also a time of greater exploration and experimentation with new flavors and ingredients. The influence of the medieval royal diet could still be seen in the way European cuisine evolved during this period, as chefs incorporated both old and new techniques into their cooking. The legacy of medieval royal feasting continues to shape modern cuisine, even as we move further from the Middle Ages. The evolution of cooking techniques, the development of food preservation methods, and the importance of food as a symbol of wealth and power all trace their origins to the medieval period. The royal kitchens of the time, once a place of indulgence and excess, became the foundation for the culinary traditions that would come to define European cuisine. Today, we look back at the medieval royal diet not just as a relic of history, but as a critical turning point in the development of food culture, one that continues to influence the way we think about food, power, and culture. Asterisk. As we reach the final chapter of this journey through the medieval royal diet, it's time to reflect on how these royal eating habits have influenced modern culinary practices and our own relationship with food. The grandeur of medieval banquets, the lavish feasts, and the unexpected eccentricities of royal dining have left an indelible mark on how we view food today. But beyond the visual spectacle of feasting and indulgence, there is a deeper legacy that traces its way through the evolution of European cuisine. The royal kitchens of the medieval courts were not simply places of excess. They were the birthplace of many culinary innovations, and many of the techniques, ingredients, and ideas that were developed there continue to shape our modern meals. Let's start by considering the culinary advancements that took place in the medieval royal kitchens. As mentioned earlier, the medieval period saw the refinement of food preservation methods, including salting, smoking, pickling, and drying. These techniques were essential not just for survival, but also for allowing the royals to enjoy a wide variety of ingredients, even during lean times. Today, we take for granted the availability of fresh food all year round, but the preservation methods developed in medieval kitchens were the foundation for many of the ways we store and prepare food today. The use of herbs and spices, which was elevated to an art form in the royal courts, also influenced modern culinary practices. The importance of spices in medieval cuisine cannot be overstated. While they were originally expensive and often reserved for the wealthy, spices like saffron, cinnamon, and pepper became more accessible over time and began to infiltrate all levels of cooking. Modern dishes, from curries to pastries, owe much to the bold flavors that medieval royalty brought to their kitchens. It was during this period that spices started to become a key component of European cooking. And while the royal banquets of today may no longer feature the same exotic spices, the tradition of flavoring food with herbs and spices has continued to thrive in kitchens worldwide. In addition to the practical elements of medieval dining, the royal court also made food a part of cultural expression. The medieval meal was a performance, a way to celebrate status, power, and wealth. Today, food is still a vehicle for cultural identity, whether it's a family recipe passed down through generations or the rise of global fusion cuisine. The medieval tradition of food as a means of expression is alive and well in modern culinary traditions. Think of the elaborate tasting menus served in Michelin-starred restaurants, or the artistry that goes into designing the perfect plate of food. Just as the medieval kitchens showcased a kingdom's wealth and influence, modern chefs continue to use food as a canvas for creativity and personal expression. Even the royal approach to food as a means of diplomacy has echoes in our own time. The importance of food in international relations cannot be understated. Just as medieval monarchs used lavish feasts to negotiate alliances, modern politicians and diplomats often use meals to strengthen bonds with allies and demonstrate goodwill. The art of entertaining with food, of creating a memorable dining experience, remains a powerful tool in the world of politics and diplomacy. The use of food to establish and reinforce relationships has persisted throughout history and today. Food remains one of the most powerful ways we connect with others. However, beyond the ceremonial and social aspects of food, there is also a lasting influence in the way medieval royalty embraced and experimented with local ingredients. While medieval monarchs were certainly known for indulging in exotic imports, they also turned to local farmers, artisans, and markets for many of their ingredients. This shift toward using local products and focusing on seasonality would resurface in the late 20th century with the rise of the slow food movement. The return to fresh, seasonal, and locally sourced ingredients is now seen as not only a culinary trend, but also a way to support sustainability and local economies. The concept of eating in harmony with the seasons, once practiced by the medieval court, has become a key element of modern food culture. In terms of health, the lessons learned from medieval dining are still relevant. While medieval royal meals were often indulgent and excessive, there was a growing awareness during the period of food's role in health and well-being. The use of medicinal herbs and the focus on balance in the royal diet foreshadowed the modern emphasis on nutritional foods and functional ingredients. Today, we are more health conscious than ever, and many of the foods that medieval royalty sought out for their medicinal properties, such as ginger, garlic, and leafy greens, are still widely recognized for their health benefits. The idea that food can be both delicious and good for the body has permeated our modern approach to eating. Additionally, the careful attention to food quality, preparation, and sustainability practiced in medieval royal kitchens has carried over into modern culinary training and food sourcing. Today, chefs are more attuned to where their ingredients come from, how they are grown, and how to prepare them in the most respectful and sustainable way. This mirrors the attention medieval royal kitchens paid to the origins of their food, even as they sought the finest ingredients from across the known world. The very idea of a chef as a skilled professional who crafts dishes to please and impress is rooted in medieval traditions, where culinary artisans and cooks were valued for their expertise in the kitchen. Finally, the medieval royal diet's influence on our modern perception of feasting and dining cannot be understated. The grandeur of medieval banquets may seem like a far cry from our current meals, but the fundamental purpose of food bringing people together has not changed. Whether we are enjoying a family meal, dining at a restaurant, or attending a celebration, food continues to play a central role in fostering connection and building community. The medieval royal feasts were, at their core, a way to create moments of togetherness and to express the importance of shared experiences. Even today, as we sit around tables laden with food, we continue the tradition of bonding through shared meals. The indulgence of medieval royals may have given way to healthier, more conscious eating habits, but the idea of food as a symbol of celebration, power, and unity remains just as relevant today. As we reflect on the legacy of the medieval royal diet, we see that it has left a profound impact on the world of food. From the culinary techniques it inspired to the cultural significance it imbued, the kitchens of medieval monarchs were not just places of luxury and excess. They were the birthplace of many of the ideas, practices, and traditions that continue to shape how we approach food today. From the art of preservation to the use of herbs and spices, from the importance of seasonal ingredients to the role of food in social and political power, the medieval royal diet laid the groundwork for the way we eat, celebrate, and connect with others. And as we continue to explore the intersections between food, culture, and society, the legacy of medieval royal dining remains a reminder of the enduring power of food to shape both our bodies and our world.